Warning, some viewers may be too lame to enjoy the following information.
There is no denying that Space Mountain at the Magic Kingdom is one of Disney World's most popular and well-known attractions. The Disney World Space Mountain is the original Disney Space Mountain coaster, and this version consists of two indoor tracks that take guests on a journey through time and space. Located in the Tomorrowland section of the Magic Kingdom, Space Mountain has been thrilling riders since 1975. In many ways, the Walt Disney World Space Mountain roller coaster was absolutely ahead of its time. For one, it is the world's first completely indoor steel roller coaster, and it is also the world's first coaster to be completely controlled by a computer. The number of trains that each track can safely operate at once is mind-blowing, and even most newer roller coasters do not run as many trains as Space Mountain does. In this video, we will be taking an in-depth look at the Walt Disney World Space Mountain to learn how the ride came to be, how ahead of its time the ride was when it opened, how complicated the operation of this attraction is, and the issues that can arise when operations do not go smoothly. If you guys wouldn't mind hitting the like button, that would be greatly appreciated, as that helps the channel greatly against the YouTube algorithm. Alright, let's dig in. Before we get into the history of Space Mountain at Walt Disney World, the story first begins in Anaheim, California. On July 17th of 1955, Walter Elias Disney would open Disneyland, the world's first Disney park, and the only Disney park built under the direct supervision of Walt Disney himself. Disneyland would become immensely popular, and just 1 year after the grand opening, the park attracted 5 million guests to visit the park. And in 1957, the park would attract its 10 millionth guest. This would help lead to the park's first major expansion just a few years later. The 1959 expansion introduced new rides to Tomorrowland, like the Submarine Voyage and the Disneyland Alweg monorail system, as well as another earth-shattering attraction. That ride would be a roller coaster named the Matterhorn Bobsleds, the first thrill ride found at Disneyland. The attraction was also the first tubular steel-tracked roller coaster in the world. The ride featured two different tracks, located inside an artificial mountain themed after the famous Matterhorn Mountain of the Alps. After climbing an 80-foot or 24.4 meter tall lift hill, riders traverse through the mountain as they descend through small drops, navigate tight turns, and reach speeds of 27 miles per hour or 43.5 kilometers per hour. The ride ends with a splashdown, where trains run through a small pool of water, which is used to help slow them down. Matterhorn bobsleds instantly became a popular hit, and it was proof that thrill rides could be successful at Disneyland. This inspired Walt Disney to come up with an idea for a second roller coaster during the 1960s that would be based upon a futuristic space travel theme. In 1964, Walt approached John Hench, a designer and creative director at WED Enterprises. You probably know WED Enterprises today as Walt Disney Imagineering. A major renovation was planned for Disneyland's Tomorrowland in 1967, and the goal was to debut the new space-themed roller coaster as the marquee attraction of the newly revamped Tomorrowland. The original name for the ride was Spaceport. The name Space Voyage was also tossed around. It wasn't until June of 1966 that the concept would be called Space Mountain. The attraction would consist of a roller coaster ride through the dark, with lighting and other special effects. WED Enterprises would partner with the Aero Development Company, who had also helped design and manufacture Matterhorn bobsleds in the 1950s. Initially, the idea for the ride was to have 4 separate tracks, and for portions of the roller coaster to take place outside the massive mountain. But there were a few issues. For one, Disneyland simply did not have the amount of land available to build this massive version of Space Mountain. Another issue was due to computer technology at the time. Being that the ride would be located in the Tomorrowland section of Disneyland, John Hench wanted the ride to be run completely by computer. This would bring another futuristic element to the coaster, as computers monitored the location of each train on the track and kept them at a safe distance from one another with the use of timing sensors. This would allow for more trains to safely operate on each track and boost rider capacity. However, to make this safety system possible, computers would also need to be capable of rendering the entire track layout of Space Mountain. Unfortunately, computer processing power at the time could not handle the automation of such a safety system or rendering the path of the ride's track. Disney instead had to wait for computers to improve, relying on Moore's Law, which states that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles every 2 years. Even with this setback, design work on Space Mountain continued as WED Enterprises worked to fit a version of the attraction in the available space at Disneyland, but the ride was ultimately shelved. A big reason for halting work on Space Mountain was due to a massive project located in the eastern United States. On November 15th of 1965, Walt Disney announced that his company would be building a new Disney park just south of Orlando, Florida. This park would be even bigger and better than Disneyland. The company purchased over 30,000 acres, or 121 square kilometers of land, for their new Florida project. One thing Walt Disney disliked about the Disneyland property was that his company had no control of the land outside the park. This led to a large number of small businesses, motels, and restaurants to populate the surrounding area of the park that Walt didn't agree with. Whereas with Disney's Florida project, the company would have control of all surrounding land. Just over a year later, Walt Disney would tragically pass away on December 15th of 1966. Walt's tragic passing did not halt the Florida project, however, and Walt Disney Productions would push forward to make Walt's vision a reality. Roy Oliver Disney, Walt's brother and business partner, would delay his retirement to become head of planning and to oversee construction of the project. He would later name the property Walt Disney World in dedication to his brother. On October 1st of 1971, Walt Disney World opened its doors with the grand opening of the completed Magic Kingdom Park, as well as the Contemporary Resort Hotel and Polynesian Village. The first phase of the Walt Disney World Resort proved to be immensely successful, and in the park's first 2 years of operations, it drew in over 20 million guests and employed 13,000 people. Some of the opening day attractions at the Magic Kingdom included many legendary favorites like the Haunted Mansion, the Jungle Cruise, It's a Small World, Peter Pan's Flight, and so many more. Altogether, there was a total of 23 attractions at the brand new Magic Kingdom. Of these 23 attractions, only 3 were unique to the Magic Kingdom, and the other 20 were somewhat copies of attractions found at Disneyland. Magic Kingdom was also very popular amongst teenagers and adults, and of the park's 23 attractions, there were no thrill rides to cater to the older audience. This pushed Walt Disney Productions to install a thrilling attraction at the Magic Kingdom. An early idea was to recreate the Matterhorn bobsleds in the Fantasyland section of Magic Kingdom, but at the time, Fantasyland did not have the room for Matterhorn, as much of the space was taken up by 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea Submarine Voyage. However, the Tomorrowland section of the Magic Kingdom had the space necessary to build a large thrilling attraction. WED Enterprises returned to their plans for the space-themed roller coaster, planned for Disneyland, and began working on installing the ride at Walt Disney World. Thankfully, computer technology had improved significantly by this time, which would allow for the ride to be designed by computers and also to be completely computer automated. The original concept was to place the attraction at the southern end of Tomorrowland, just how Space Mountain is placed at Disneyland today. However, this is not where the attraction will be built. The original plan was based on a version of Space Mountain, then known as Space Voyage, that was designed to fit at the smaller Disneyland park in Anaheim, California. This version was completely different, where the ride would have still featured 4 tracks, and portions of the coaster would have taken place outside the building. The building itself also had a completely different shape, and was much smaller in size than the Walt Disney World Space Mountain we know today. As design work continued, WED began changing the attraction to customize it for the Magic Kingdom. They dropped the number of tracks from 4 to 2, and they also worked to make the roller coaster completely indoors. This led to the shape of the building to change into the circular cone we know today. This building was much larger in footprint and would not fit where the ride was originally planned, so designers changed the location to the eastern side of Tomorrowland, across the railroad tracks. This also helped to address another fear designers had, where the massive show building for the attraction would distract views of the park's main icon, Cinderella Castle. Overall, these changes made Space Mountain the first attraction at the Magic Kingdom installed beyond the berm of the park. To help fund the construction of the attraction, Walt Disney Productions landed RCA as a sponsor of the ride. RCA actually had a prior contract with Disney, where they installed all of the resort's communication and computer equipment. Part of the contract also gave RCA the option to sponsor a ride of their choice, and they liked the futuristic concept of Space Mountain and chose to sponsor the ride. Thus, RCA gave Disney $10 million to have their company name and image endorse the ride. Vertical construction of the ride officially began on December 15th of 1972. Crews began to erect the massive show building for the ride, known as the Satellite Building, which would stand at a height of 183 feet, or 55.8 meters, and feature a diameter of 300 feet, or 91.4 meters. To help shrink the height of the overall building, WED Enterprises actually built the show building 15 feet, or 4.6 meters into the ground to lower its overall height. At the center of the building are 4 large vertical concrete columns, which support a central concrete roof 145 feet in the air, or 44.2 meters. On the perimeter of the building is a large ring of concrete columns that support concrete beams. The sloped roof of the building is made possible with the use of 117-foot, or 35.7 meter long concrete beams, each weighing in at 148,000 pounds, or 67,131.7 kilograms. These massive concrete beams connect between the central roof and the perimeter concrete beams. In total, there are 72 of them. There was actually an accident while transporting the very first of these massive concrete beams to the Magic Kingdom. While en route to the Disney World property, a concrete beam slipped from its trailer and crashed down onto the pavement. The accident occurred at 12:29 a.m., so hopefully not too many others were on the road when this incident occurred. Apparently, the beam fell as the truck and its double trailer made a wide turn through an intersection. As the rig went through the turn, the beam slipped from the trailer and crushed a lamppost and smashed a sidewalk in the process. The beam came to a rest, upside down, only about 900 feet or 274 meters away from Interstate 4. This gigantic beam had only been cast about 29 minutes before it crashed to the ground. Bill Irwin, construction manager of Buena Vista Construction Company, the builders of Walt Disney World, said work crews would have to completely destroy the $60,000 piece of concrete to remove it from the street. Luckily, only 2 people received minor injuries from this accident. That would be the driver of the truck, Walter Humphrey, and John Aycock, an employee of Buena Vista. They were both treated at the nearby Tampa General Hospital and released shortly after. Following this hiccup, construction of Space Mountain continued. Unlike the Matterhorn bobsleds, where Aero Development worked with WED Enterprises to design and manufacture that roller coaster, Space Mountain was for the most part an in-house project. As a result, Aero Development were not actually the ones to manufacture the track for the ride, as Aero was busy designing and manufacturing their Mine Train roller coasters. Thus, they had no additional capacity to handle a ride the size of Space Mountain. It's rumored that the defunct roller coaster manufacturer, Schwarzkopf, actually manufactured the track for Space Mountain, but the ride is still more of an Aero coaster than a Schwarzkopf. While Aero was not contracted to work directly on the attraction, Disney did have other contracts with Aero Development for other rides at the time. WED Enterprises would borrow Aero employees from their other projects to help with Space Mountain, and they also used Aero's track specifications for the ride. This is why when you see Space Mountain's track, it looks just like Aero track. As the building began to come together, the roller coaster's track and structure began to take shape, as it was erected inside the show building. Work would continue as crews finished the massive building, the ride's 2 tracks, and also the long queue, which would need to run underneath the Walt Disney World Railroad. Overall, construction of the attraction would take over 2 years. Space Mountain was originally supposed to open for the 1974 summer season. However, there were a number of issues that required modifications to the track profiling. Many of the ride's transitions were too rough and needed adjusting. Keep in mind that Space Mountain was only the second roller coaster built by Disney, and they did more of the work themselves this time. Due to pressure from RCA, the sponsor of the ride, Space Mountain actually soft opened for the Christmas season of 1974. And due to ongoing problematic areas of track, a few injuries were reported, although nothing too serious. The ride would be shut down again, as more modifications were made to the banking in and out of certain curves and the transitions out of different drops. Finally, on January 15th of 1975, over 10 years after the original idea for Space Mountain was conceived, the attraction would officially open to the public. The Walt Disney World Resort now had its first thrill ride for older guests to enjoy. The grand opening of the ride was conducted with the help of real astronauts, such as Scott Carpenter, an astronaut on the Mercury 7, Gordon Cooper, an astronaut on the Mercury 7 and Gemini 5, and Jim Irwin, an engineer and astronaut on the Apollo 15. Overall, the cost to build Space Mountain came in at a whopping $20 million US. That's equivalent to over $96 million US in 2021. In fact, the Walt Disney World Space Mountain cost more to build than all of Disneyland in 1955, as Disneyland cost about $17 million US. Space Mountain proved to be a massive hit for the Walt Disney World Resort, and even today, after 46 years of operation, the ride is still extremely well known and draws in massive crowds. Both tracks begin with a drop into the strobe tunnel, which is filled with pulsating blue lights. Rockets ride through a turn and begin climbing the 90-foot or 27.4 meter tall lift hill. Both tracks ride through the same lift hill show scene. After dropping off the lift, riders begin racing through the dark as they twist through various turns and helixes and head down many drops, producing several moments of airtime. Multiple projectors inside the building produce star fields, comets, galaxies, and even asteroids. The largest drop on the ride is only 26 feet or 7.9 meters, and trains gradually make their way back to ground level as they race through nearly 3,200 feet, or 975 meters of track. Although both tracks are identical, One is slightly longer than the other. I'll talk about that a little later in the video. The ride's top speed is only 28 miles per hour, or 45 kilometers per hour, yet it feels so much faster as you race through the dark, unable to see where you are going. The ride ends with another special effects tunnel called Re-Entry. This leads into the ride's unload station, which is directly underneath the load station. From here, guests disembark the attraction and begin their way down the long exit path back to the other side of the building. This exit tunnel actually runs parallel to the Star Corridor. When the ride first opened, the exit featured a moving walkway called the Speed Ramp that would take guests through the Home of Future Living exhibit. The exhibit showcased future technology ideas and concepts from RCA and was meant to show what was possible with their company. This would lead guests back into Tomorrowland. The ride originally opened with different rockets than the ones you see today. While the current rockets seat riders individually, allowing for 3 riders per car and 6 riders total per train, the original rockets seated 2 riders together, toboggan style. 2 riders would sit together per seat, and each car had 2 seats, allowing for 4 riders per car and 8 riders per train. These trains were actually identical to the original cars found on the Matterhorn bobsleds, except Space Mountain immediately began operating with 2 cars per train rather than just 1 car per train like on the Matterhorn. The original trains also featured seatbelts as the main restraint for riders, and each passenger had their own seatbelt. These trains would run until 1989 and were then replaced with the newer 6-person trains that featured lap bars. The original lap bars were U-bars and wrapped around riders' legs. The lap bars we have today are T-bars, where the central shaft of the lap bar rises between riders' legs. Currently, each track is able to operate a maximum of 13 rockets, although the ride usually operates with a max of 12 rockets. I've heard in the past, 14 rockets was the maximum the ride could operate per track, but this may have been changed. At this point in the video, rather than discussing the different eras of theming, sponsorships, and renovations made to Space Mountain, we will be focusing our attention on just how crazy the day-to-day operations of the attraction are. As I mentioned earlier, Space Mountain is the world's first computer-controlled and automated roller coaster. And it isn't just one roller coaster that is computer automated, but technically 2, since there are 2 separate tracks. By computer controlled and automated, I mean the ride has the world's first computer controlled block zone system. For those of you who are unfamiliar, a block zone is a section of track that only one train may occupy. At the end of a block zone is a method to stop a train in case the block zone ahead is still occupied. This is the safety system that prevents roller coaster trains from colliding with one another. Well, Space Mountain has an absolutely rich system of block zones, and if your favorite part of my videos is when I talk about blocks, then this might just be your favorite video of mine. Let's dig in. So here we have the layout of Track A, or Alpha, on Space Mountain. When you enter the load station, Track A, or Alpha, is to your left, and Track B, or Omega, is to your right. Both tracks feature identical layouts and also identical block zones, so I will start by only picturing one track to avoid confusion. Without accounting for areas like the dispatch break, load station, the unload station, and the space in between the 2 stations, there are 15 block zones. The load station is capable of holding 5 rockets. After dispatching from load, your train moves into the dispatch break, which is right before the drop into the strobe tunnel. After being released from this break zone, the train drops into the tunnel where we have Zone 1, or Block Zone 1. This leads into a curve, and riders begin climbing the main lift hill. The main lift hill consists of zones 2 through 6. Because of this, the lift hill is capable of carrying 2 trains at a time, keeping at least one empty zone between each train. Following the lift hill is the gravity portion of the coaster, which consists of zones 7 through 15. Zone 7 starts immediately off the lift hill and lasts until the brake run parallel to the lift hill. Next is Zone 8, which consists of a 270-degree downward helix and ascent into a brake run. Then we have Zone 9, which consists of the ride's second helix, followed by a turn and hop into a brake run. Zone 10 begins after this, with the curve into the ride's first large drop, and following track that leads into the brake run parallel to the lift hill. Next is Zone 11, which starts with the drop off the brake run, which leads into a second large drop, and then ends with the brake run. Zone 12 begins with a large drop off the brake run, and upward curve into another brake run. Zone 13 begins with the downward helix off this brake run, and the following track into the next brake run. Next is Zone 14, which consists of the turn into the red tunnel, and the following brake run that actually slows down the train. These are called the retarder brakes. The train then enters Zone 15, which is the final brake run before the unload station. Next, the train enters the unload station, which is capable of holding 4 rockets. As I mentioned earlier, the unload station is directly underneath the load station. In order to get back to the load station, rockets actually wrap back around through a pill-shaped pass. This section is capable of holding 2 trains and is called the lower lift. As its name implies, this area features another lift hill called the lower lift, which brings trains back to the height of the load station. The lower lift can store one train, and a brake run right before the lower lift, called the lower lift brake, can store another train. Thus, this area can store 2 trains. All of these block zones are what allow Space Mountain to run a maximum of 13 rockets on each track. So let's count all the block zones. We have the 15 zones I mentioned earlier, which consist of the strobe tunnel at the beginning of the ride all the way until the brake run before the unload station. Then if we add in the unload station, the lower lift area, the load station, and the dispatch brake before the strobe tunnel, we have a total of 19 block zones. And to further complicate things, if we factor in that the unload station can hold 4 rockets, the lower lift area can hold 2 rockets, and the load station can hold 5 rockets, technically, the unload station is 4 block zones, the lower lift is 2 block zones, and the load station is 5 block zones, meaning a total of 27 block zones per track. But for further fun, the unload area also has a 5th block zone that trains aren't technically capable of stopping in, but it's still considered a block zone, so 28 block zones per track. And with there being 2 tracks with identical block zones, that means a total of 56 block zones are found inside the satellite building. And this is on the world's first roller coaster with computer-controlled block zones. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the tracks is slightly longer than the other, and that is Track A or Alpha. It's slightly longer than Track B or Omega by just 10 feet, or about 3 meters. While both layouts are completely identical, Track A sees extra length during Block Zone 8. Track A is just slightly longer here so that it can overtake Track B. Otherwise, the downward helixes of both tracks would collide directly into each other. Now, keeping up with all of these block zones is no easy task, and operations at Space Mountain must remain very consistent to keep things running smoothly. Before I describe the issues that can arise when operations begin to fall behind, please keep in mind that Space Mountain is a very safe attraction. And all the things I will describe next are the safety system working properly and as designed. When the ride first opened, it ran an older aero development software. If you've seen my prior problematic roller coaster videos on Magnum XL 200 at Cedar Point or Big Thunder Mountain also at the Walt Disney World Resort, you'll know where I'm heading with this one. Basically, Space Mountain was not able to stack a train outside of the unload station. By this, I mean the ride had to keep pumping trains out of the load and unload stations to avoid having a train stop in Zone 15, as it waited for space to open up in the unload station. If a train were to stop in Zone 15, a ride cascade stop would occur. A cascade would shut down the ride and essentially cause a breakdown. So this is not like a situation on a more modern roller coaster, where after stacking multiple trains, the trains will automatically advance forward after another dispatches from the station. No, the ride would completely stop and shut down. 5 rockets at most are allowed in the gravity portion of the coaster, so zones 7 through 15. Once a rocket had to stop in zone 15, the other 4 rockets would catch up and also come to a stop. There would also be 2 trains climbing the lift hill. As soon as a train stopped in zone 15, the lift hill would automatically stop, causing the 2 trains to stay in place. Now, having all the trains come to a stop meant the ride was operating as it was designed to, and this kept all riders safe when operations fell behind and rockets began to back up. The only issue was a ride cascade stop was non-recoverable, and it required shutting down the ride in order to manually reset the attraction. Some of you may be aware of the major renovations made to Space Mountain in 2009, where the ride received a major cosmetic upgrade, especially in the ride's queue and load station area. While the ride's operating software also received a major upgrade. The 2009 upgrade helped alleviate the risk of a ride cascade stop and also the severeness. It is now possible to have a recoverable cascade where the ride can stack rockets even in the gravity section and not have to shut down. Once the unload station begins to back up, the main lift will slow to a creep mode, which will limit the number of rockets that enter the gravity section. If the unload station fills to capacity and causes a train to stop in zone 15, the main lift will completely stop, just as it used to. Except now, there will only be 3 rockets in the gravity zone instead of 5 thanks to the main lift slowing to a creep. These 3 rockets will come to a stop in zones 15, 14, and 13. With the ride's new programming, these zones are recoverable, and once one space in the unload station opens up, the rockets stopped in zone 15 will automatically advance into unload, allowing the rockets in zone 14 and 13 to automatically advance forward as well. To help with that, zones 15, 14, and 13 all received booster wheels or pacers to help get trains moving again. These block zones previously did not have a propulsion method. As these trains begin to advance, the main lift will also reset and begin moving again at full speed. Now zones 15, 14, and 13 are the only blocks that can be automatically recovered. If a ride vehicle stops in any of the gravity zones prior to that, the ride will shut down, just like it used to, and require a manual reset. Going back to before the 2009 upgrade, Space Mountain had no method of avoiding a cascade. Ride attendants simply had to remain diligent and continue pumping rockets out of the stations at a consistent rate. When a cascade would occur, where rockets would come to a stop in the gravity section was a little odd. The first rocket would stop in Zone 15, followed by the second in Zone 14. The brake run of Zone 13 is completely flat, and at the time, featured no booster tires to move a stalled train. Thus, the third train would stop at Zone 12 instead. The fourth train would then stop in Zone 11. Zone 10 was even weirder than Zone 13, and its brake run was not only flat, but sloped slightly uphill, meaning if a train were to stop here and then be released, it would roll backward instead of forward, so the fifth train would stop in Zone 9. Once a cascade would occur in these days, the ride would shut down. The ride crew would turn on the lights inside the show building and walk out to the various stopped rockets. The crews would have to reset the brake zones and physically push the rockets out of the block zone so they could proceed forward. Up until only a few years ago, guests would stay in their rockets while the ride crew reset the attraction from a ride cascade stop. It was only due to more recent changes to Disney's operating standards that guests now have to be evacuated from the rockets before a reset can take place. Now, even with the 2009 upgrades to Space Mountain, ride cascade stops are still a possibility. They are just less likely to happen. The ride can now have trains stop on zones 15, 14, and 13 without causing a cascade, but if any train stops in a zone before that, like Zone 12, the ride will cascade. As I mentioned earlier, the current programming of Space Mountain will slow the lift to a crawl if the unload station starts to back up, which limits the number of rockets in the gravity section. The ride can stop rockets in zones 15, 14, and 13 without causing a ride cascade stop. Once a rocket stops in zone 15, the main lift will stop in place as it waits for the block zones ahead to clear, leaving two trains stopped on the lift hill. Once a spot opens up in the unload area, the stopped rocket in zone 15 will advance forward, and so will the rockets in 14 and 13. At the same time, the main lift will also rev back up to full speed and send the two previously stopped rockets into gravity. But if the unload station becomes backed up again, you now have 4 rockets in gravity. So the rockets will stop in zones 15, 14, and 13, which is fine, but the fourth rocket will stop in zone 12, which automatically triggers a ride cascade stop. From this point, the ride is technically broken down, and the ride crew will manually have to reset all the block zones. The funny thing is that the new programming does not skip block zones. Earlier, I mentioned that the brake run in zone 10 is actually sloped uphill. If a cascade is ever bad enough that a rocket stops here, cast members have to be very careful as they manually push the car forward, ensuring that it doesn't roll backward instead. Now thankfully, the modifications made to the ride's programming severely limit the number of cascades that occur. In the old days, it was common for a cascade to occur every single day. With the newer programming, cascades occur far less often, maybe once a week at most. This allows the ride to stay open more often, so that guests can continue to enjoy the attraction. Another method cast members use to avoid cascades involves the ride's storage track. The storage track is parallel to the unload station and actually loops around between the end of the unload station and the start of it. If trains begin backing up, crews will begin dispatching trains out of the unload station into the storage area. The storage area actually consists of 2 parallel tracks and in total can store 9 rockets. The storage area then reconnects to the start of the unload area. Space Mountain is able to accommodate a large number of guests every hour, as the attraction has an extremely high capacity. The ride has an automatic dispatch feature that will time how often a train is released into the circuit. This automatic dispatch is at the dispatch break before the small drop into the first tunnel. The computer will automatically release the next train based on a timer, unless the cast member at tower, which is main controls, manually holds a train from dispatch. The dispatch break can release a train every 29 seconds, 26 seconds, 23 seconds, 21 seconds, and as low as 19.5 seconds. When releasing trains at 19.5 seconds, this means that each track can cycle a max of 184 trains per hour. With every rocket holding 6 riders, that means that each track on Space Mountain has a theoretical capacity of 1,104 riders per hour. So combined, the whole attraction has a theoretical maximum capacity of 2,208 riders per hour when both tracks are in operation. This is achieved when each track runs 13 rockets, but capacity is very similar when the ride runs 12 instead. As long as crews are diligent and continue to dispatch trains from the unload and load station on a consistent basis. This is why the ride, more often than not, runs 12 rockets instead of 13. Because the capacity with 12 is so similar to 13, and running 12 rockets helps to further limit the chance of ride cascade stops, which keeps the ride open more often than not. Over the years, Space Mountain has also seen a few other changes that help with operations. The ride has always had an automatic dispatch feature that releases trains into the strobe tunnel, but it's gotten smarter over the years. Originally, the automatic dispatch did not take into account the weight of each train, so if an empty train were ahead, the ride would automatically release a fully loaded train right behind it at the normal dispatch rate. What would actually happen is the fully loaded train would run faster than the empty train and catch up to it. Thus, the fully loaded train would need to stop in one of the block zones during the gravity portion of the coaster, causing a ride cascade stop. To prevent that, the cast member at tower or the main control room of the coaster would need to manually prevent the fully loaded train from dispatching immediately behind the empty train with the use of a dispatch inhibitor. This would create a gap between the trains and allow enough space for the empty train to stay ahead of the fully loaded train. This is something called sandbagging. However, the dispatch brake was updated and now weighs each train. Now the ride system automatically accounts for the weight of each train and will hold a dispatch if necessary. In the spring of 1976, Disney actually closed one track of the ride at a time as they made modifications to the track profiling. This was to help further smoothen the ride experience as well as reduce stress on the ride vehicles. The ride also opened with additional safety brakes that were placed immediately after the end of every block zone during the gravity portion. Designers feared the trains might be too heavy and that the brakes on each brake run wouldn't be enough to stop a train in case of an emergency. So extra brakes were placed after each brake run as a safety measure to ensure trains would be able to stop somewhere. Thankfully, the brake runs themselves were plenty enough to bring trains to a stop, so the safety brakes were deemed redundant and were later removed. Eddy current brakes, or magnetic brakes, were also added to the ride sometime around 2012 or 2013. These brakes act as trims toward the second half of the ride and slow trains slightly at the end of Block Zone 11 and midway through Block Zone 13. These trim brakes activate based on how fast a rocket is running and will slow a heavier train that is traveling faster much more than a lighter train that is traveling slower. So if you couldn't tell, Space Mountain not only has a rich history, but also has some seriously wild operations. The world's first computer automated roller coaster is no slouch and operates with a much more complicated system of block zones than even most modern roller coasters. And it gets even crazier once you realize that there are two tracks with equally as wild operations. The satellite building is filled with organized chaos. Let's not forget the People Mover attraction that also runs through this building. There is no doubt that Space Mountain is one of the most influential roller coasters ever built. And even though the ride is over 45 years old, it still remains an extremely popular attraction at the Walt Disney World Resort. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope you learned something new. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know if you'd like me to make a similar video covering the other Disney Space Mountains. Thanks for watching, everyone. Peace.